study called Human Computer Interaction, and they talk about not putting regularly used buttons next to buttons that can kill the whole thing. So Zoom lost on that one. Anyway, here we are. This is Eyes on Oregon. Joe Moore, John Dennis. We are here to talk about the status of the really interesting project in Oregon. First time ever in America this is happening. The state of Oregon voted for legal, I think, adult use of psychedelic mushrooms in supervised environments. And there's a lot going on, John. And you are the person I know that's been most involved in this project. And it's helpful you're an attorney in Oregon. So what disclaimer do you want to give first after I say something like that, John?
First off, I'm not, unless we have a signed document establishing an attorney-client relationship. We don't have an attorney-client relationship. This is all just intended as general advice or general information, not advice in any way, shape, or form. Advice requires lots of information from you about your issues before we can tailor the advice, take it out of the information category. So there's that. And B, this process is that Oregon's going through requires rules to be adopted. And what we're essentially following in the series is mostly the discussions at the Psilocybin Advisory Board and its various subcommittees. Mm-hmm. And when they make recommendations, those aren't binding. The Oregon Health Authority then takes those under advisement and consideration, and then they ultimately adopt rules. And so just because there's a recommendation made or not made, is not dispositive as to what the rules will ultimately be in Oregon or elsewhere. So those are the two main caveats we like to get out of the way.
Cool. And yeah, John, it's a really interesting time. We've got a handful of months left, roughly 6, before we're really gonna, I think, see announcements from the state on what this whole thing looks like. And right now there's a whole committee. Is that what it's called, a committee? And there's like a chair and like a whole board and public comment, all that kind of stuff. What's the committee called?
Yeah, so the main group is called the Psilocybin Advisory Board, or the Oregon Psilocybin Advisory Board. And there's been 5 different subcommittees that were formed of that. There's one that looks at licensing, training, products, equity, and just drawing a blank on the other one right now, which is training, equity, licensing, products, and
we'll get it later. All good. If anybody wants to throw that in the chat, we will happily include it. Cool. So you have been involved in watching nearly every single meeting that's happened there. So you know all the players, you know how the different kind of dividing lines are opening up. Maybe the first thing I want to get into is this really interesting discussion, medical versus adult use. And you sent me a few articles, and it seems pretty clear to me that this is not a medical situation, and the state does not want it to be discussed as a medical situation. What was the language in the what is it called, a proposition Prop 109 or something?
The measure, yeah.
Measure 109.
Yeah. So it talks in the kind of introductory periods that the purpose of this is to increase the availability of psilocybin as a therapeutic option that's affordable and safe for people. And then it talks about promoting the general well-being and the social well-being of all the citizens of Oregon. And so there is some language kind of near the beginning that talks about it as suggesting that it could have therapeutic applications or therapeutic use. And I think the kind of the bigger argument for it being therapeutic, as in my view, is the fact that the campaign kind of sold it to voters as therapy. But as a lawyer, when I read through it, it doesn't really appear to be highly therapeutic in its nature. And so there's a fair question of what therapy actually means. And therapy, can mean a lot of things. People talk about play therapy or music therapy or art therapy or massage therapy or talk therapy or even retail therapy or something like that. And and usually therapy, as it's defined, and when I look it up in the dictionary, it's kind of addressed towards a particular ailment or malady. And Oregon doesn't require that a person have any kind of ailment or malady at all as a precondition to taking psilocybin in the program. In fact, it's specifically written into the measure that the health authority may not require an ailment in order to take psilocybin. So that's kind of the counter argument is if it's not addressing a problem. I think Michael Pollan borrowed the phrase, I think from Charles Grobe or somebody, the betterment of well people. And so that's definitely one possible application of the Oregon program is people who have no problem, like no disorder that's diagnosed or anything like that, can go and use psilocybin in the program. And the other argument against it is that this is being administered by people who have high school diplomas. The health authority may not require more advanced education than a high school diploma, coupled with this particular facilitator training to be the person who administers the medicine. So
right. So you don't need to be a therapist, psychologist, doctor, etc., in order to be a facilitator here, or people don't need a prescription, right? Like you don't need to go to a prescriber to do this stuff. So I think that's essential. So it's kind of clear this is not medical because there's no prescriber in the mix. That's how I see it. Not necessarily a prescriber. I'm sure if prescribers got in there, they could say, yes, like this is what I prescribe to you, though that's going to be a little iffy on licensing boards, I think, medical boards and all that. But
I just noticed there was some discussion in the organization that licenses therapists in Oregon about Measure 109. I was just reading through its minutes the other day and saw that they were discussing it, and with some alarm that it is kind of I think they're starting to wrestle with it in ways in their meetings now, and I haven't sat in on any of those yet, but I'll probably attempt to just to see kind of what they're saying and how they're like what their concerns are, if it is, if people who are licensed to be therapists do work with psilocybin, kind of what the overlapping roles and the potential conflicting duties and obligations of the different license types have. One of the main, kind of linchpins of Measure 109, as I see it, is that psilocybin services are supposed to be administered in what's called a non-directive manner. And
that's fascinating.
That potentially includes both, the prep sessions and the integration sessions before and after the service, and that's kind of after the psilocybin session, and that's kind of in many ways very, there's a lot of types of talk therapy that are much more directive in its approach. So it's kind of where the overlap is and how those things intersect remains to be seen. But we were talking earlier, Joe, about the non-directive.
Knew it was coming.
Yep.
Yeah, man. So like, what is the non-directive approach? So I was just recording with Stan Groff the other day and his wife Rikita, and we were talking at length kind of about how psychoanalysts, CBT therapists, psychologists, etc., will probably need to check their worldview at the door if they want to deliver most optimal outcomes. If you want to follow a non-directive approach, which it sounds like it's a lot of being non-directive, which is interesting. Maybe that's still being fleshed out. I don't know. So non-directive approach to me is following the person, following their lead. They're leading the dance and you're following. And you want to really help them accentuate what they're expressing. If we're coming from this kind of Groffian, post-Groffian frame where, the material inside that's carrying the most charge is the one that's going to be expressed first, perhaps it's helpful to look at that, not go like, oh, let me like psychologize this about your mother. What about just working with the material that's expressing itself, vocally, body-wise, otherwise? Yeah. So there's a lot there, and this non-directive approach, I feel, is quite nice. It scales really well. it allows for people, you know, without clinical educations to do this kind of stuff pretty well. It doesn't take a lot to keep somebody safe. And, you know, let us remember, wildly undereducated people by Western values and standards have been doing this stuff for many thousands of years, in my opinion, quite well. So let's not shit on people for only having high school diplomas here.
Right. And I hope I never come across as sounding that way. I mentioned that simply just to, you know, kind of counteract the public perception that this is therapy, because most people don't think of therapy as being administered by a person with that particular set of credentials.
There's really interesting arguments, John, right now that psychedelic assisted work is not the same by any stretch of the imagination as traditional psychotherapy. That's a very hotly debated topic right now, and I kind of think there's something to that, given the amount of time I've spent in these spaces. And yes, I've been to therapy, and it looks very different. Like what happens in the office is not what happens when you're on the mat. And there's big ranges of this, right? You know, what if you're doing a microdose with talk therapy, or like, you know, not very much with talk therapy? That's kind of a different deal, and that's not exactly non-directive. So, or it's, well, explicitly non-directive.
I have yet to ever. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, did I miss anything on my description of non-directive approach? I think I did. I'm a little fried, so sorry.
Yeah, the thing I like about non-directive approach is that it kind of just holds space for not knowing and not rushing into to putting answers and you know, assigning meaning to something, and to hold mystery and tension with an openness towards it maybe being able to have an unfolding process, that rather than somebody coming and telling you this is the meaning of your experience, I mean, it really should be, I think, decided by the person over time. And you know, I still have had you know, psychedelic experiences from over a decade ago that I'm still unpacking and processing. And you know, if there were somebody who I recognize as a informed person who is standing over my shoulder saying, "Oh, that's what this means," then it probably would have taken a lot of the kind of profound impact that I'm thinking of one in particular had on my life. And it just sort of gives space to not know. And in our society, we don't really do a whole lot of like not knowing, you know.
So an example would be like, oh, you had this owl and it did this in your experience. Do you want to lecture the person on the meaning of an owl? And that's fraught with trouble, because cross-culturally it has so much meaning, in like very different meanings cross-culturally. So, you know, what I've seen done well is hand somebody a book on symbolism, like an encyclopedia, and like let them kind of explore it on their own, if they're looking for that kind of like certainty, not like getting in there and saying, oh, this is what owl means. It's like, you know, come on. That person is the world's foremost expert in them and their life. That person. So meaning there's like 7.6 billion or whatever experts on the planet in them. And it's probably not you about somebody else. Odds are really low. So figure out how to encourage them, encourage curiosity, and yeah, what's going on inside? Like, let's try to figure it out, you know? Yeah. So that's a lovely conversation, and I think we should have that more often. I think I should actually build a program on that. So, well, we kind of do already have that. But I was going to say. Anyway, so John, when do the recommendations need to be into the state from the advisory board?
So by statute, they're due by the end of June. And then by statute, the health authority has a 6-month period during which they will submit them through the public comment process. Actually, then first draft the rules based in part, at least, on the recommendations, and then send it through public comment. And then they have to be adopted by the end of December of this year. So now we only have 1 year left before people who are intending to apply for licenses in Oregon have to get all their ducks in a row, do all their planning, get everything ready to go by January 2nd of next year.
This doesn't sound right.
Not
I
a
feel
lot of
like there's
time.
something going on here that's a little troubling. Like providers need to know what the training looks like. There's this whole manufacture quagmire that happened in cannabis. How do you get the spores? How do you get the product on January 2? If services are allowed by January 2, to me, it sounds like there's probably going to be a delay. But is that something that's being discussed at all, like a possible delay?
Yeah, there's been some discussion, particularly about the kind of the chicken and the egg question with facilitators. So if you're going to train facilitators to have experience in working with psilocybin, but there's no place for them legally to do that, at least in the United States, how does the first batch of both trainers and facilitators get their experience? Do they work with psilocybin with the facilitator or the trainers themselves not being licensed to do that? Or do they work with a different kind of like type of altered state of consciousness? Do they work with either ketamine or breath work or something else like that? And there hasn't been a conclusive answer to that, but it is this kind of, first generation kind of problem of like, how do we get that first kind of troop out that's trained and ready to go? And it's not clear how that plays out exactly yet. But one thing I haven't heard, and I'm really glad for, is nobody suggesting, oh, people ought to just like go overseas and pay all this insane amounts of money for travel and lodging and all that to get licensed or trained in another country. There'd be some upsides to that, but overall, to not kind of have that, give sort of an advantage to the people who can afford to do that, I think is definitely a good, more of an equal playing field from the gate opening.
Does it feel like there's a lot of competitive attitudes here? Like, I have to be first kind of thing?
It's hard to know. I definitely think there are, I guess, do you mean at the board, or do you mean just generally in the realm of
the feeling in Oregon, the board, whatever, but like just the general sense and what you're experiencing in state?
I have definitely, so I sit on several different kind of, I don't sit on it like formally, but I'm a part of different like group chats and things like that. And, and there is like some sense of people grabbing opportunities that go out there and trying to kind of apparently hog them for their own or that sort of thing. And, so there is certainly some amount of competitiveness. And, I think that's probably, fairly expected just based on kind of the potential like high stakes, that Oregon brings to this. But, still there's so there is like that on the one side, but on the other side, there is kind of just, the underground, I think, has just been so hungry for this for so long and is so ready for it that there is this sense that together we can build something really beautiful. And I think on your all's Facebook page, Joe, and a few others I've posted about, what does it mean to, like, why can't we start dreaming up some really rad nonprofit, service center types that aren't motivated by profit and that's completely devoid of profit motive and just has.
You've not seen a nonprofit yet, right?
I've talked to a couple of folks who are working or thinking of, planning them or plotting them, and that is exciting. But it's still kind of early to see exactly what form those will take. But there is, I was very heartened. Like when I posted that, I hadn't really heard anyone specifically talking about it. So there are people talking about it, and I'm also interested in starting a nonprofit that does that, and maybe even a couple of different nonprofits. But that's kind of the interesting thing about it is just, this is the first generation of kind of legal psychedelics in the United States, and in my view, it's just critical that we have kind of a community supported, community led alternative to profit model at the earliest inception of the program. Because, as Oregon model gets exported other places or in modified and adopted, so that it's part of the vocabulary and the menu of options that people identify, that you can have a nonprofit service center. You can keep your costs as low as, I mean, it remains to be seen how low they can actually be, but I hope that there is, I don't usually advocate a race to the bottom, but with how kind of outrageously expensive, for-profit psilocybin services will likely be, it would be nice to have that really low cost option that still, has the same kind of supports and things built into it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually like accessible to normal people.
Right. I'm actually trying to pull up like salaries, for instance, in Portland, Oregon, just to have kind of, a place. So for instance, like, this list is horrible. Nurses, I have no idea, but bill rates on psychologists, you're talking at least $250 an hour. Psychiatrists, probably a bunch more if insurance isn't covering it. Doctors, you're lucky if you're getting away with $150 an hour. It's probably $250 an hour plus. Can people afford that? What is a livable wage in Oregon, and what people can access this training and deliver services that provide them a living wage? I think that's a really great piece of math there. Is there a way to link up with religious groups to offer this stuff? I think yes. Yeah, like race to the bottom is important here. Like we need, if we want to see this actually impact people that need it, we are going to need to see some people willing to work on this and not try to make money. Because if we do a quick Pareto analysis, like 80-20, like most people can get 80% of the benefit here from low cost services. If you want to pay for that extra 20%, sure you can, and you will be able to. But that's, something we've really got to consider.
Yeah, and I know in a lot of kind of circles and a lot of different economies, alternative economies, it's kind of anathema to actually sell, mushrooms or any kind of sacrament like that. And
totally,
some people are just offended by the very notion of charging a price for it instead of gifting it or exchanging it for something other than money. But but unfortunately, one of the things that's written into the measure is that a service center can't give away product as it's kind of incident to the rest of the stuff. So it actually has to be sold in Oregon.
Come pay for therapy and you get free mushrooms kind of thing, or come for a massage and you get free. Yeah, okay.
And I think part of that is that's where it's taxed too, is like the services don't get taxed by the state in the same way that the product does. It has like a 17% tax on the sale of product. But so I mean it's not like a bad reason for that, but it just sort of, forces money into the money exchange as part of the program. So unfortunately there's not really a way around it entirely, but
right. It's really interesting. As soon as tax and regulation comes in, it's like really interesting incentive for legacy operators to kind of scale and start putting the heat on, because they've already got infrastructure. They've been growing for 30 years plus sometimes, and I think I mentioned a while ago, mushroom prices in Canada, at least a few months ago, were near zero in some locales. You couldn't even sell them because the market was so flooded because of this whole interesting rush. I think government cannabis kind of did it in Canada, but taxation's doing it here in Colorado. People are trying to get out of cannabis and growing mushrooms, at least for a little bit. They've got to figure out what's next after that. But it's it's gonna be an interesting quagmire when that comes. I don't really know what else to say about it other than watch for it. And when people start saying increase the taxes, increasing taxes makes the black market have better incentives to scale. So watch it carefully.
For sure. And the other thing about the pricing of it that I think I've seen on the agenda for one of the subcommittees in the next couple of weeks, you're going to address is the facilitator to client ratio. I think that's just one of the most absolutely critical pieces of the whole measure and all of the regulations that are going to come out. I think the facilitator to client ratio, or the client to facilitator ratio, is one of the most important decisions that Oregon's going to make about this, because there's several references in Measure 109 to the health authority needing to balance the conflicting objectives of safety on the one hand, and then accessibility and affordability on the other. And the best way to do that is to keep the actual per hour cost down to a minimum, as low as can be, reasonably justified. Because if you had, a large group with relatively few facilitators, and then that the cost of the facilitators is spread evenly, presumably across multiple people, that's the best cost control method that exists, as far as I see. I mean, there's other things like service centers could be, high-end resorts, or they could be very kind of minimalist kind of nature retreats that, have, low cost options available. But the one issue that there's really no working around is hiring facilitators to be present. So to the extent—
What's the current debate? Is it like 1 to 4, 1 to 2, 1 to 1?
So the licensing subcommittee had kind of made a recommendation quite a while ago that it would be 3 clients to 1 facilitator. And that was quite, like I said, it was quite a while ago. And that was before there was any discussion about microdosing being allowed. And so I've taken the position that the dose really does matter for the facilitator client ratio. If people are on, 5 grams plus, they're going to probably need more support than if they're on a gram or less.
This is hard logic, John, right? Because it's probablys. Because I've seen some people eat 1 to 2 grams and it looks like they're on 14, and also vice versa. So it's that's such a hard conversation. I actually don't even know what to make of that. Is it a heated discussion?
It hasn't really, they haven't really discussed it a lot, although I'm heartened to see that they are going to be, one of the subcommittees is reviewing it later this week, kind of revisiting it, I think, particularly in now that there's serious discussion about microdosing, it just kind of changes the whole kind of balance of the equation. And the other thing that I've thought about kind of more recently with respect to the facilitator client ratio that I think would be important for Oregon to keep in mind is that particularly for religious institutions that have, people who go to ceremony, regularly, whether that's weekly or monthly or quarterly, people who are kind of more familiar with and acquainted with like the altered states and the kind of the psilocybin experience, both in themselves and in other people, they may be able to provide the same kind of harm reduction assistance while under the influence and while in ceremony to kind of reduce the need for a completely sober sitter. And my understanding of, for instance, like the Santo Daime Church is like they have their guardians, and the guardians who kind of are the people responsible for safe, taking care of folks who need some help during their ceremony. I believe, and I'm not 100% sure about this, but my understanding is that they take some daime, which other people refer to as ayahuasca, in the ceremony, and they either take a lower dose or they're just familiar enough with the experience that they can still kind of function and assist where needed. So rather than assuming that all harm reduction assistance has to come through a facilitator, I would love it, especially in religious contexts, but possibly other contexts as well, if there could be some mechanism that allows peer-to-peer support to reduce the need if there's kind of strong group cohesion and there's, the people who are doing the sessions together know each other and have experience doing it together. There's a point where if you have a rigid ratio that's, in effect in all circumstances, it may be kind of an unnecessary formality that just has the consequence of driving up the price without really serving a true benefit or purpose for client safety, which is the kind of policy reason behind having facilitators. It's safety. And so if there's other mechanisms that don't require people being paid, however much, I don't know, I'm guessing it's around, $30 to $50 an hour. If you could cut out 3 or 4 people because you have experienced, members of that particular community who can function in the same or similar role, and why wouldn't you allow? I mean, that would be the one thing that I think Oregon can do that would allow a really low cost option, particularly for the kind of minimalist outdoor type retreats or service centers that will, keep things on the low end. I mean, if you had that coupled with a peer support model, and you could keep, only a couple of normal like paid facilitators, and then other community members who look out, who are experienced and whatnot, then I think that is the magic key, in my view, that would allow it to actually be affordable and something you wouldn't have to, save, months in order to afford. You could potentially go, without having it, tap into your savings, significantly or something like that. So
that's good. There's so much I want to get into on the religious topic, but I don't believe we have time. Let's plan on more religion talk next week. Hopefully
can I give a
superstar to join us.
Can I give a quick plug for,
yes.
So I'm in the process, I'm hoping to champion the issue of religious liberties in Oregon for religions that use psychedelics as their sacrament. And as I've been trying to come up with what the potential protections should be, like what types of religious practices should be permitted under the measure, I find that there's really not any data out there, at least not that I've been able to find. And if somebody's listening out there and knows about like a survey that looks at kind of the diversity of psychedelic religions, or particularly psilocybin religions, to say, this percentage, have song and dance, this percentage have, walking meditations or whatever, to find the types of activities and the religious practices that Oregon could potentially protect for religious institutions that apply for licensure under Measure 109. So I'm trying to gather data, and I've drafted a survey that's being reviewed by some other lawyers who represent psychedelic churches, with the hope that we can gather information, share it, and then actually have some data about how many people this potentially would impact if we don't, protect religious use. So if anybody wants, is listening and wants to be involved with that, please email me. My email is jdennis, DENNIS, at psychedelicsgo.com. And I'd love to, I particularly need a statistician or some kind of, researcher, because I'm sure there's ways I could make the survey less biased or, more kind of objective and that kind of thing. I'm trying not to do that, but, there's people who specialize in that sort of thing, and I'm sure it could use some assistance. So please reach out if you or someone might want to help with that. So anyway, that's the end of the plug for now, and we'll talk more about the results from that when we get those back. But
beautiful. Okay, so like we said earlier, there's about 6 months left, end of June, before the committee needs to put these things over to the state health authority. And is there a meeting every week at the advisory board level?
So the advisory board only meets monthly itself, and then the subcommittees, most of them started with every 2 weeks meeting schedule or twice a month meeting schedule. And I think most of them have kind of gotten tired. I think most board members serve on multiple subcommittees.
Yikes.
And so it ends up being a whole, and then there's of course all the work they do between the meetings. So it ends up being a ton of work. I think that most board members do for the board. And I think folks are just getting tired, like all of us.
Of course. Yeah.
You know, so yeah, there's not a lot of time left for sure before final recommendations are due.
So it's 6 meetings left.
At
or
most.
5 at most. Yeah. Interesting. And is it fair to say that just about almost every major decision is still yet to be finalized and ratified by the group?
Well, so we talked a few weeks ago, I think it would have been mid-December, about a list of formal recommendations that were made around training and products. Those were supposed to be the final recommendations period with respect to those issues, because the health authority has, in my view, wisely kind of expedited the rulemaking process for those areas, because in order for the program to be operating by early 2023, they need certain pieces of that in place sooner than others. So, so the later pieces that need to be resolved still are due no later than June by statute, but I believe the authority is actually trying to even expedite that a little bit so that there's more time for them to draft the actual rules and get public comment, and go through the rules advisory committee process to really, make sure that beyond just the recommendations themselves, I mean, the drafting takes, a ton of time. Probably even more, as much deciding what you want to draft, because there's just an insane amount of detail that goes into all of it.
In a ridiculous type of language that I don't think is human. Sorry, John, but it's a lawyer joke, everybody. But yeah, it's tough, man. So let's talk about what happened last meeting. However you want to approach that.
So it was kind of a crazy meeting. We are running low on time, and there's just a ton of nuance that has to go into these rules, and there's no ready-made template because Oregon is the first to do something kind of like this. And so the last meeting was curious for a number of reasons. There essentially was no real agenda scheduled for it other than kind of updates from the subcommittee. In fairness, the meeting was on the 22nd of December, really close to Christmas. So maybe there was just the thought of they'd pick a lax day instead of it being scheduled for the usual 3 hours. It was only scheduled for 2.5. But the lack of an actual kind of thorough agenda or normal agenda led to a proposal to be switched, to move to public comment, which is reserved for the very last part of the meeting. They started talking about moving to public comment around a half hour into the meeting, kind of, not really completely maximizing the precious and limited time left to resolve everything that's left to be resolved. If there's 6 more meetings after December, that's a max of 18 hours of full board time to figure out everything, to make all the recommendations. And if the actual deadline is earlier than that, then it could be as little as half of 18 hours. It could be, not much time at all. So it was the public comment that emerged was very spirited, we'll say. And, people were really frustrated with, all these issues to be resolved still. And, for some reason, we're not taking the time to try to explore them. And, some people argued that with there not being these things put on the agenda, people hadn't had a chance to prepare, to research, and to do their background work to be able to come to the meeting prepared to discuss. But that being said, there's still just lots of things that had been discussed that some members of the board were very vocal in saying that we need to have these discussions to get clarity on these, and ultimately that they didn't prevail in trying to kind of utilize some of the limited time that's left. So it was kind of curious, but that's the process. This is a somewhat political process, and there's people get, it's kind of it's a process. And, there was even an attempt to move to discuss these things, and that was even shut down and didn't even get put to a vote, which was like kind of interesting. But so
like by statute, does there need to be a vote?
Well, but according to their bylaws, I believe a person, I haven't actually read through them all, at least not in a long time, but, in theory, if, a person can make a motion for just about anything, and it can get voted on, and it didn't even get voted on whether they, utilize the rest of the meeting kind of effectively. So then the public comment lasted, I think, around a whole hour of lots of people just weighing in very strongly and passionately about, we need to, work together. Oh,
like more than 4 by lots, do you mean?
More than 4
people giving their perspectives or thoughts?
It was almost a whole hour of public comment. I didn't count them, but it was probably more than a dozen, maybe, and multiple people giving multiple comments.
I'm thinking about Parks and Rec, where they do like public comment periods, and it's an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, right.
I imagine most people have a lot of really heartfelt thoughts on this matter, and they want to be heard. And it's probably scary to not be heard, right? Because this stuff is literal religion for people. It is sacred for a lot of folks. It is also life-saving for a lot of folks. So they've seen it not only save their lives, but their friends in a lot of interesting ways. So yeah, like I get shit for talking about recreational use, right? Like find that ridiculous, but like the fact that we have to have these conversations at the state level in Oregon, I find it terrifying, honestly, but I do think it's the best way forward that we've got. But how many people have enough time to really understand everything that's going on here? Not very many.
Not very many. Frankly, I think there's folks even folks on the board are spread really thin and may not be able to, I'm not sure every single member is fully, apprised of all of the issues and all the nuance that goes into them. I think most of them are, but there's at least a couple that, I don't think are. And that's the thing about a democratic society and a democratic process, is that, it's supposed to be a free exchange of ideas, and the best idea is supposed to win after debate and consideration. And, you have, like you say, Joe, the folks for whom it's religion, or it's been the thing that's healed them. And, there's also people who stand to make a lot of money off it being a certain way. And, and from the out, as a kind of an outsider to the process, somewhat, you can only speculate as to what, why that happened like that. And it's, we just hope that in the spirit of democracy and healing and unity, that we're all passionate about these things, and we all really want the program to be the best it can be, and to help as many people as possible. I think almost everybody shares those values and those goals, but I think we sometimes forget that common kind of vision when we get kind of mired in the details a lot of the time.
Let's talk about excluding people, John.
Yeah.
So this isn't a medical thing. There's plenty of, let's call them precedents, right? Nobody tells you if you can and cannot buy alcohol, tobacco, unless you're not of age. There's pretty wild compounds out there you can buy legally and nobody tells you you're not allowed to, especially at the state government level, right? But there's discussion right now, from what I understand, about people with certain medical diagnoses possibly being not able to access this stuff, and that being, by law, right? Like the state says, if you have these disorders, you're legally not allowed to have this stuff. Let's get into that. What do you got here?
Yeah,
we got about 12 minutes.
Okay, all right. Try to be brief. So first off, there's been a call from the Oregon Health Authority's psilocybin services policy analyst, who's kind of the person who ultimately, drafts the rules. He has made a couple of requests that the hard contraindications, the things that if they even exist, that would be the hard disqualifiers, where if you have this condition, you are ineligible to take psilocybin in Oregon under the lawful program. What are those? And first off, so that's like a fundamental question. And so far, there hasn't been like a solid answer that's emerged from the group or the board kind of discussions. So I'm curious to hear from you, Joe. Do you have a sense of any type of medical indication that would be a hard no, like, which means in effect that a person who has this condition should never, ever, ever do it? Nick, take psilocybin. Are you aware of anything that's
ready for some jokes? So somebody afflicted with pregnancy probably should not be eating mushrooms. Probably. There's minimal clinical data on this. I just think it's not worth the risk. Especially if you're, greater than 4 months through it, like even the last 3. From the Groff point of view, there's a theory that you could be triggering early labor, which can be very dangerous. I think people with like wildly high blood pressure should be a little risky, should be a little iffy. Like we should just watch that. And there should probably be some medication on hand to lower their blood pressure if it gets out of control, or I don't know. I'm not a doctor. Don't want to pretend I am one, but that's a big deal. There's a lot of discussion on bipolar and schizophrenia. This is like a really classic topic. People who want to dig into this should really listen to an episode we did. I think we might have done multiple with this gentleman in the UK named Benjamin Mudge, who's doing a lot of really interesting research around including people with bipolar, various sorts of bipolar disorder into psychedelic work. He is diagnosed bipolar and has received a lot of help from compounds like ayahuasca or substances like ayahuasca. So there's a lot there. And then there's a really interesting fellow in Australia named Matt Ball, a nurse practitioner, psychiatric nurse practitioner, I believe diagnosed schizophrenic. And we've had him on the podcast at least once. Past student of ours, and he's got this really interesting framework he's trying to develop around what is it called, Psychedelic or something like that. Like he's trying to say like these things aren't very different, and if we treat people with schizophrenia appropriately, they might be able to handle it well. That's not really his thesis. He's just arguing that people are being discriminated against heavily for their diagnoses. Even Will Hall, who did a lot of work on the Francois Bourgeat-Aron-Grossbard topic, also abused by them. And he, I think he was diagnosed with some stuff too, and he still found some help with these kinds of interventions. So I believe that's true, Will. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Will has been on the podcast. He's written for us. So you can read some of his stuff there. So that's 3 people that I think are exemplars here. I don't want to universalize. I find that really complicated. And I don't want doctors in the mix. And it's a really hard discussion, John. A person that I'm really close to or was in my life consumed a ton of psychedelics. And I think compounded with whatever kind of thing was going on for him. I haven't seen him in a decade. And I know for sure he's using here and there He's on tons of psychiatric meds. And like, I'm sympathetic for this argument. It's just, I don't want government to tell us what we can and can't do. Except, like, you know, of course, I don't want McDonald's to be including like salmonella in their chicken nuggets, you know, like, of course, I don't believe McDonald's should be allowed to do that. But is that, like, how do we make this argument around, like, what can they tell us and what can't they tell us? It's a really delicate balance. And they're here for our protection, or they're here to serve us. Yeah, are you just managing livestock, or are we actually like citizens that you work for us? I think they work for us, but could be wrong. I don't know. Been wrong before. This depends where you live, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think, you know, the town I grew up in, there was the person who, you know, everybody saw walking around or riding their bicycle, and, you know, the kind of rumors went around that they were a normal person and they took too much acid and they fried their brain and they never came back, kind of thing. And those, yeah, it's just like everybody, I think most of us have, you know, a person that we were like, oh yeah, I know a person that there's a rumor like that. Of course, how true it is remains to be seen. But I think when we talk about like safety in a program like Oregon's, you know, if a person were to enter Oregon's program, you know, who had whatever, you know, predispositions for kind of things becoming manifest, my understanding is that there's kind of a window where if a person has like a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia, that it can be kind of activated during, you know, like a period in their life, you know, and if they pass that period, there's a less chance of it becoming ever sort of activated or manifest. And I don't know if I'm not 100% sure that's right, but that's like kind of what I've heard. But even if in Oregon's program, they were to say, you know, people who have a predisposition for schizophrenia can never take psilocybin, that might be the worst thing possible, because the person who has those conditions or predispositions may exactly need a facilitator who's knowledgeable to say, hey, like, this is really risky for you. And if we tell that person, like, you're never allowed to go to a service center, and they know that, then we could be robbing them of the opportunity to have the most informed, best advice, like most medically sound information presented to them, you know, from somebody who's knowledgeable. And like, if we're going to just blanketly exclude somebody like that, then, you know, then we leave them to figure it out on their own. And that's maybe not the safest, best, you know, maybe that doesn't result in fewer people getting harmed. Maybe it results in more people getting harmed if we exclude them. So, you know, I take the view that we really ought to from just a harm reduction perspective alone, allow people to enter the service center. And then as part of the facilitator's scope of practice and as part of their responsibilities as facilitator, if they identify that the person is at high risk, then they're obligated at that point, in my view, to explain, you know, the risks and make sure that before a person proceeds, that they you know, are fully aware of all the potential hazards. And at the end of the day, you know, it's written in the measure that the facilitator is allowed to refuse to serve if they don't, for any non-illegal reason, which I think means discrimination on a protected class. But you know, I think that it's really critical that from that perspective, that from a harm reduction perspective, I think we have to kind of give space in the program for folks who have predispositions. And I think then we, you know, identify it. And, you know, if a facilitator doesn't feel equipped to handle a person that has those particular issues, I think they can refer them to someone who has a better specialty or a different specialty that they maybe could work more with people who might have higher risks and things like that. But I think just to say a hard prohibition, like, no, never, people will, you know, these people can never take it, like, it's just totally like offensive in my view. So
based on the research of Benjamin Mudge, there's actually no science behind bipolar being excluded. And it's out of an abundance of caution. and probably bred by prohibition. And that's a really complicated talking track there. All right, man. Well, I think we need to wrap here. But thank you so much, John. Thank you, everybody, for listening in. This is Eyes on Oregon, where we talk about the implications of Measure 109 coming down the pipes. And there's a lot that's going to happen this year. 2022 is going to be a big year for psychedelics, a big year in Oregon. And you can be a part of it. Yeah, I'm going to do the Oprah thing. You, like everybody, it can be involved here, and it's going to be extraordinary. But there is going to be a lot of debate and a lot of heated conversations, I think, over the next year. So strap in, put on your adult pants, and let's see what happens here in Oregon, and let's hope for the best. And if it doesn't turn out to be the best, let's make it the best later. Yeah. So, all right, John, thanks a ton, and let's do this again in 2 weeks.
Yep. We will be back, January 17th, again at 6 p.m. Pacific. Is that right?
That's it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, John. We'll see you then.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everyone.